Welcome back. All right, so the NHL is about to expand to its 32nd city, 32nd team, and yet we've been through this before. The furthest back of an expansion that I remember is 1991, which was San Jose. So everything from San Jose through to now, I remember, although I remembered all the dates of when these teams came in, because I've discussed this many times over. So it's just one of those things you commit to memory, which is, all right, when did all these teams come in? And then the question for Seattle, the same one that's been around for Vegas, is, so how much pain do your team have to go through before other hockey fans will think it's acceptable that the team has some success? Which is weird. I've always thought that was weird, that the idea of, well, they're new, they're not allowed to have any success yet. Why? And then the other one that I kind of get a kick out of is when people say, well, it takes at least 10 years. Should be 10 years. Not in a salary cap era, not the way the NHL is being run right now. There's no way it should take 10 years for you to have a good team. Now, the one caveat with that is, it is a 32-team league starting next year, and half the league misses the playoffs. So it will not be easy to create a playoff team from scratch, but it's not out of the realm of possibility Seattle may do so. So I'm going to start with the 1967 expansion, and I thought about doing everybody's, going back to the Toronto Maple Leafs, Montreal Canadiens, right from the first teams right through to the last, and I thought, no, I want to talk about expansion. So I don't want to dilute it talking about when Boston came in and Detroit came in, because that was a completely different situation, right? So 1967, the NHL doubles its size because they realize there's a lot of markets they need to get into. WHA's getting started pretty quick here, and so there's going to be a battle between WHA and NHL about who can dilute their league the easiest and the quickest, and the answer to that would be the WHA, because they were building a league from scratch. But what was interesting is that the 1967 expansion includes, and people are going to be like, why is Cleveland up there? Well, somebody sent me a Cleveland Barons fridge magnet. I thought, well, awesome, because I don't have one for the Seals either. So the Oakland Seals, California Golden Seals, and I'm wearing an Oakland Seals jersey right now. It is as ugly as in person as it is on camera. And I'm wearing a Whalers hat because I've got a Seals hat around here. Can't find it right now. I'll find it as soon as the video's done. That's the rule. But eventually they moved to Cleveland. It was a disaster. Of the 6 teams in that expansion, the Seals/Barons are an absolute disaster. Never reached a 500 record. Made the playoffs in year 2 because that 1967 expansion, they had their own division. So I cannot imagine the arguments to be going on in the modern day NHL if you had an expansion division and the playoffs were done the exact same and there wasn't cross between the divisions. Eventually there was. Eventually the NHL realized we shouldn't have these expansion teams playing in the playoffs against each other exclusively because we're screwing over the original 6. But that's what happened. So that helped the Seals get into the playoffs a couple times. Cleveland never made the playoffs, and then they were merged with the Minnesota North Stars. The LA Kings, and I tried to do this by alphabetical order of the teams that came into the league and what they were at the time they came in. So although I put the Seals/Barons at the top because it required a little more explanation, the Kings, it was 7 years before they reached 500. Now, I would normally say seasons, but since 2004, 2005 didn't happen, I just went with years. Their first year, they made the playoffs, but their 7th year, 7 years into their existence, they finally reached a 500 record, which is the same amount of wins as losses. Now, of course, it's a little more diluted. It's the same amount of wins as regulation losses. They reached the finals 26 years after they came into the league, and they won the Cup 44 years after. Is that a good amount of pain? I think so. Again, they made the playoffs that first year. The Minnesota North Stars come in. They are now the Dallas Stars. It was 5 years before they reached 500, but they were in the playoffs the first year as well. It's nice being the expansion division, right? They would reach the finals 14 years after coming into the NHL. That was a run that was stomped out by the New York Islanders. And then they finally won a Stanley Cup 34 years after they came in. Or 32 years after they came in. I got to fix that. 67 to 99 is 32 years. Philadelphia didn't have to wait as long. 6 years for them to get to a 500 record. They made the playoffs in their first year, expansion division. Finals, 7th year. Stanley Cup, also their 7th year in the NHL. They were the first expansion team to win the Stanley Cup. and they changed the game forever with their Broad Street Bullies approach. Pittsburgh, it was 6 years before they had a 500 record, same as Philly. Third year in the league, they reached the playoffs. The finals in the Stanley Cup, for them, it was 24 years after they came into the league. So, a lot of pain for Pittsburgh in between there. St. Louis, they are pain through most of their history, and yet they were 500 their second year in the league. So they were the fastest expansion team to a 500 record. They reached the playoffs their first year, and they reached the Stanley Cup Finals their first year, and their second and their third. And then Chicago moved over to this division, and that took care of that. 52 years after they came into the league, they won the Stanley Cup. So it was a lot of pain for St. Louis. And this is where you'll hear that conversation about, well, it should take a long time for a team to win. It's not fair that a team wins right away. All right, 1970. You want to talk about fair. Buffalo, it was year 3 that they got to a 500 record. Also, that was their first year they reached the playoffs. It was their 5th year they reached the Stanley Cup Finals for the first time, the French Connection. Everything looked great. They've never won a Stanley Cup. As great as everything looked for Buffalo, and right into the early 80s, Buffalo looked like a contender almost every year, just couldn't get over the hump. So they never won a Stanley Cup. For Vancouver, they were 500 5 years in. They also made the playoffs 5 years in. They made the Stanley Cup Finals 12 years into their existence. No Stanley Cups for them. So the 1970 pairing, neither of them ever win a Stanley Cup. 1967, all of them reached the Stanley Cup and win it, other than the team that was, well, destroyed, just merged with the Minnesota North Stars and eventually led to the creation of the San Jose Sharks. 1972, the Atlanta Flames come in. Now, of course, Calgary. Their third year, they got to a 500 record. They reached the playoffs in their second year. So they were competitive pretty quickly after they were brought into their formation. The problem was that while they were competitive in the playoffs, they kept getting knocked out early. Stanley Cup Finals, of course, this was when they were in Calgary. That was 14 years after they came in, and they won the Stanley Cup 17 years after they came into the league. The Islanders did this fast. Their third year, they both reached 500 and made the playoffs for the first time. They were semifinalists, and they looked like a team that might never get over the hump. They are in the late 70s. The argument was whether or not they get over the hump. In fact, after they won it in 1980, it was seen that maybe that was a bit of a fluke. That was the 8th year that they were in the league, the first time they reached the playoffs, or reached the finals, and that they won the Stanley Cup. And then, of course, they won 3 more after that, probably because people said they were a fluke. 1974, the Kansas City Scouts come in. Don't remember the Scouts? Neither do I. Colorado Rockies was then the name of the team after the move. I loved Colorado Rockies. To me, was just a name when I was a kid. I thought it sounded cool. Now, of course, that's the name of their baseball team. They would move to New Jersey, still without a winning record ever. They had never had a 500 season. They were 14 years into their existence when the New Jersey Devils got their first 500 season after Wayne Gretzky had called them a Mickey Mouse franchise years before. They reached the playoffs in their 4th year as the Colorado Rockies. Didn't last. They reached the Stanley Cup Finals and won the Stanley Cup 21 years after they were brought into the league as the Kansas City Scouts. And I know the striping on their jerseys are kind of a callback to the Scouts and the Rockies eras, which is fine, but I've always wondered why. They didn't win anything with those. Why? Just keep your stripes the way they are. But they didn't. The Capitals, it was 9 years before they reached 500. 9 years before they reached the playoffs. 24 years before they reached the final. And, of course, 44 years before they reached the Stanley Cup. If you want to have the argument that it should take a decade for your team to get good, I present to you the Washington Capitals, a team that was so miserably bad early in their existence. 8 wins that first year. So 1979, this expansion deserves an asterisk because it was the WHA expansion. And rather than just let the WHA teams come in, the NHL went, oh, no, some of our teams have rights to those guys. You've got to give them up to the teams that own the rights. And then we're going to have an entry-level draft with some of your guys as well. Peter Pocklington had to get creative in order to make sure Gretzky wasn't taken, meaning signing him to a big contract that didn't mean anything. But it was 3 years before the Oilers had a 500 record. They had already achieved infamous status as being a pretty good underdog. They made the playoffs their first year in the NHL, and they were exciting to watch. They made the Stanley Cup Finals in year 4, and they won the Stanley Cup in year 5. So there's not as much of a stink raised about it because they came in from the WHA, right? This was a team that was already established. Carolina came in as Hartford. So this is where the WHA problem comes in. And Gary Bettman would say this after all three teams had moved, that the problem was WHA, the three letters WHA, which didn't make Oiler fans feel good because they were the lone survivors at that point. Hartford, it took 7 years for them to reach 500. They did reach the playoffs that first year with Gordie Howe in their lineup. It was 23 years before they reached the finals and 27 years before they won the Stanley Cup after they came into the league. The Quebec Nordiques, now of course the Colorado Avalanche, it took 3 years for them to reach 500, 2 years for them to make the playoffs. They reached the finals 17 years in, and that was also when they won the Stanley Cup. Sadly, that was the year after they left Quebec. That, of course, was the Colorado Avalanche in 1996. Winnipeg, 3 years after they came into the league, they were 500. They also reached the playoffs. They've never been in the finals, never made it to the Cup, and, of course, are now the Arizona Coyotes. I've discussed this before, the Winnipeg Jets were really a team that had a lot of problems, and eventually a few things conspired to get them moved out to Arizona. The NHL made it right some years later. So 1991, after 12 years of 21 teams in the league, the NHL expands. And San Jose comes in, and their team was a dog's breakfast. Now, it was an expansion that also included the Minnesota North Stars, because why not? It was a dispersal expansion thing, and it was weird. So for San Jose, it was 7 years into their existence before they got a 500 record. But in their third year, they reached the playoffs. And San Jose was a team you didn't want to play in the playoffs at that point either. They were quite capable of knockoffs. They reached the Stanley Cup Finals 25 years after 91, and they've never won the Stanley Cup. So this is where you get into that argument too about whether or not new teams should be given a good team. So 1992, you see two teams come in with different perspectives. The Senators come in, drafted young out of the expansion draft and looking to the future. Tampa looking more towards the immediate future. For Ottawa, it was 6 years in that they reached 500. 5 years in, they make the playoffs. Stanley Cup Finals, 15 years after they came into the league. They've never won the Stanley Cup. I know people are going to say, but Ottawa's got all those. Not this franchise. This franchise did not win a Stanley Cup yet. Ottawa, or Tampa, I should say. Sorry, Tampa. 4 years in, they reached 500 and the playoffs. It is interesting to me that 500 was 2 years later for Ottawa, but they only made the playoffs 1 year after Tampa. Tampa reaches the finals 12 years after they come into the league, and they won the Cup that year as well. 1993. The Anaheim Ducks come in. 4 years into their existence, they reached 500. 4 years into their existence, they reached the playoffs. That was 1 year after Florida had done both of those things. Stanley Cup Finals would be 10 years after they came into the league, and the Stanley Cup would be 14 years after for Anaheim. For Florida, 3 years, 500, and playoffs. And Stanley Cup Finals also was 3 years. So, again, we talk about fan bases should go through a lot of suffering. Florida really didn't early. They made up for it after that by never winning a round again. But they didn't win the Stanley Cup that year. And, it was 3 years in. They looked like they were going to be really good. And John Van Beesbroek could be their goaltender for a while. 1998, Nashville comes in. Took them 6 years to get to 500. This is when your expansion draft is really, really not great. Playoffs also took 6 years. Stanley Cup Finals, that was 19 years after in 2017. They, of course, do not have a Stanley Cup. Atlanta comes in 1999. They would move to Winnipeg. So here you go, right next to each other, Arizona and the Jets. Atlanta, it took them 7 years to reach 500. It took them 8 years to make the playoffs. That was the only time the Atlanta Thrashers made the playoffs. The Winnipeg Jets have been much better than the Thrashers were. But no Stanley Cup final, no Stanley Cup for them either. So that's both. If they've been in Winnipeg, they're not allowed to be in a final. I have no idea why that is. 2000, we have two teams come into the league. They've never reached a Stanley Cup final either. Columbus, took them 9 years to get to a 500 record. As competitive as they were, they didn't have a winning record for a very long time. That was also when they reached the playoffs, was 9 years in, and that's when Steve Mason came in out of nowhere and looked great. So no Stanley Cup finals, no Stanley Cup. For Minnesota, they had a pretty good run in 2003, so it was 3 years in, they had a 500 record, and they made the playoffs, never made it to the finals, never won a Stanley Cup. And of course, then you get to Vegas. 2017, all ones. .500 record, playoffs, and a Stanley Cup final, all in year one. However, the Stanley Cup is still eluding them. So if you look at the fastest that a team has come into the league and won a Stanley Cup on the board here, you're looking at Philadelphia at 7, the Islanders at 8. You get into ridiculous numbers like St. Louis, it took 52. Great for Wine to age 52 years, I think. I would imagine. I don't think it can go bad. Maybe. But, yeah, Pittsburgh, 24. Dallas/Minnesota, 32. The Kings, it took them 44. But again, then you got the Flyers in there with 7. And then you get into no, because the 1970 expansion, clearly cursed. That's the only logical excuse, right? Not that the teams are run badly or anything. And then you get into the 90s expansion, no cup, no cup, no cup, no cup, no cup. None. So this is, I really think this is why the expansion rules have been changed. Not just that they're giving, like, buckets and buckets of money, but I think the NHL realizes, as the league's gotten bigger, that may be part of the reason why it's harder to win Stanley Cups. But a lot of these franchises have not had that success, and maybe they were handcuffed a bit, and yet it took 3 years for playoffs, 5, 4, 3, 6, 8 for Atlanta, and Atlanta had nothing out of the gate. 9 years, 3 years. So the idea that it should be forever before your team is competitive, I don't necessarily agree with that. And, the NHL seems to be doing its best to make sure that this kind of thing doesn't keep happening where you're having to move teams. So the only team that's had to be moved of the expansion, of course, was the Atlanta Thrashers, and that's because they didn't have a building, and the ownership situation was a disaster, so they had to get out. But, yeah, that's the only one. And before that, yeah, there were plenty. But, again, the problem here was WHA, other than the Oilers. Again, that's according to Bettman. And then you have Kansas City, Atlanta, Minnesota, and the Seals. These guys right here, ugly jerseys and all. And they became the Cleveland Barons that then were merged. And that's the only team that's actually been merged with another team. So the idea of, well, the NHL should look at contraction. I've seen that a couple times on the expansion video I did a few days ago. There's no desire for contraction. You'd have to go through the NHLPA, and they'd be like, no. So if a team was in a position where, we'll have to contract, NHLPA would step in and say, you guys should look at moving the team or maybe selling the team rather than contraction. So anyways, there you go. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. And here's the predictor I want. So with Seattle coming in this year, what do you expect? Do you expect Vegas level success? Do you expect like maybe Minnesota level success where third year they make the playoffs, third year they get to a winning record? Since winning records are a little easier to get now than they were back then, what do you expect from them? Let me know your thoughts in the comment. And it's right now that they don't have your players yet, they don't have everything together yet, it's much more unpredictable, but it's fun to try to predict. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe. If you're browsing your way through, you just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.